In early 2003, television screens across America were flooded with maps, missiles, and absolute certainty. Inside locked rooms in Washington, a very different story was beginning to unfold, away from cameras, away from flags, and far from the podiums. Classified briefings were painting a more fragile picture. Beneath the language of confidence, cracks had already started to appear. The questions were there. America was preparing to invade Iraq on one central claim, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. It was a charge powerful enough to shift history, powerful enough to justify war. But inside the intelligence world, some of the evidence was far weaker than the public understood. Some reports were uncertain. Some claims were disputed. Some conclusions sounded stronger in public than they did in private. One of the most dramatic claims involved so-called mobile biological weapons labs. The image was terrifying: hidden trucks, moving across Iraq, carrying deadly capability. But this claim leaned heavily on a source known as Curveball, even while officials had already documented serious concerns about his reliability. Then came February 5, 2003. Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations and presented America's case to the world. It was one of the most important speeches of the moment. Calm, controlled, serious, the kind of speech that can move nations toward war. To many watching, it sounded firm, it sounded credible, it sounded final, and because it came from Colin Powell. But history would later reveal how fragile parts of that foundation really were. What looked solid in the spotlight was in places unstable underneath, and once war begins, fragile foundations do not stay hidden for long. That is where the real suspense begins, because this story was never only about Iraq. It was about something larger, something harder to rebuild once broken. It was about whether the world would continue to believe the United States after the first shot was fired. Because credibility, once spent, is not easily recovered, and in matters of war, trust can be as powerful as weapons themselves. Later Senate findings would conclude that many of the major judgments in the 2002 intelligence estimate were overstated, or not fully supported by the underlying reporting. In simple words, some of the strongest public claims were not backed by equally strong evidence. And there was another warning, one just as serious. Some pre-war assessments had already cautioned that building a stable Iraq would be long, difficult, and deeply turbulent. Removing a regime was one thing. Controlling what came after was something far more dangerous. Those assessments warned that Iraq's internal divisions could erupt into violence. In other words, even before the invasion. Some officials understood that the aftermath could become its own disaster. So the warnings were there. Uncertainty about the weapons, uncertainty about the consequences, uncertainty about the cost. Not one uncertainty, but several. Each one serious enough to matter. Then came the silence after the war began. Warehouses were searched. Facilities were inspected. The desert was crossed. Teams looked for the stockpiles that had helped justify the invasion, but the promised discoveries did not come. The Iraq Survey Group later found that Iraq had no active stockpiles of chemical or biological weapons and no revived nuclear weapons program in 2003. Saddam Hussein still wanted the option to rebuild capability if sanctions were lifted, but that was not the same as the threat the world had been told was already there. Issue was what had already been set in motion. A war had begun. Lives had been changed. Decisions had crossed the point of no return. A region had been shaken. Instability spread outward. Violence deepened. And the consequences of the invasion moved far beyond the language of the original briefings. America's credibility, once used as a force of its own, had been spent in full view of the world. Allies watched. Rivals watched. Ordinary people watched. And many began asking the same question: if this case was wrong, what else could no longer be trusted? Sometimes great powers do not stumble because they are weak. They stumble because power can create its own momentum. Sometimes it is the meeting room, the briefing room, the quiet place where uncertainty speaks in a lower voice than certainty, and where one ignored warning can echo across the world for years. Because empires do not always fall from lack of strength. Sometimes they fall because doubt whispered the truth and no one stopped to listen.